In the closing months of 1944, Central and Eastern Europe entered a decisive stage of the Second World War. The collapse of Axis defenses in Romania during the summer had opened the southern approaches to Hungary, exposing the Carpathian Basin to the advancing Red Army. The coup of 23 August 1944 in Bucharest, in which King Michael ordered the arrest of Marshal Ion Antonescu and declared an armistice with the Allies, brought Romania out of the Axis camp and into alignment with the Soviet Union. Overnight, the Romanian army, which had fought alongside German units since 1941, now turned its weapons against its former ally. This political reversal not only deprived Germany of vital resources, especially oil from the Ploiești region, but also created a new operational front, stretching from the Transylvanian mountains toward the Hungarian plain. The Soviet leadership, under Joseph Stalin, aimed to exploit this sudden change by pushing rapidly through Romanian territory into Hungary. The goal was not only military, but also political, to secure control of the Danube Basin, cut Germany off from its remaining allies in the Balkans, and ultimately seize Budapest before the Western Allies could exert influence in the region. The Soviet Second and Third Ukrainian fronts, commanded respectively by Marshals Rodion Malinovsky and Fyodor Tolbukhin, were assigned the task of advancing through Transylvania and Banat toward Hungary. Together, these fronts fielded more than 900,000 troops, supported by over 1,600 tanks and self-propelled guns, as well as large artillery and air contingents. On the Axis side, Germany and Hungary faced a strategic crisis. The Wehrmacht had already suffered heavy losses during Operation Bagration in the summer, which destroyed much of Army Group Center in Belarus. In the south, the collapse of Army Group South Ukraine after the Soviet Jassy-Kishinev offensive had resulted in the loss of approximately 400,000 men, killed, captured, or dispersed. In this context, the German High Command sought to stabilize the front by organizing Army Group South under General Johannes Friesner, later replaced by General Otto Wöhler. Hungarian forces, numbering about 2,000 men, but suffering from shortages in equipment and training, were integrated into these formations. For Germany, Hungary was crucial. It contained the last major oil field still accessible to the Reich, and its geographical position shielded Austria and the heartland of Central Europe. Within Romania, the population faced uncertainty. The country had shifted alliances, but the war continued to rage across its territory. Cities such as Cluj, Oradea, and Timișoara became focal points of military operations as Soviet and Romanian troops clashed with German and Hungarian defenders. Civilians were caught in between, subject to bombardments, requisitions, and the chaos of rapidly changing front lines. Romanian soldiers, often fighting alongside Soviet units, faced the psychological strain of engaging former comrades in arms. For many, the campaign symbolized both liberation from German influence and subjection to Soviet dominance, a duality that would define the country's post-war trajectory. Intelligence estimates on all sides revealed the scale of the confrontation to come. Soviet planners believed that rapid exploitation of Romania's defection would allow them to push into Hungary before German reinforcements could arrive. German assessments, by contrast, highlighted the need to delay the Soviet advance along the Carpathians and the Transylvanian plateau to buy time for defensive preparations along the Hungarian frontier. Both sides recognized that the terrain would play a crucial role. Mountain passes, river valleys, and fortified towns created natural choke points, complicating the movement of large armies and heavy equipment. As autumn advanced, the stage was set for one of the fiercest campaigns in southeastern Europe. By October 1944, the Red Army and its Romanian allies were approaching the Hungarian border in force, while the Axis regrouped to defend what was now termed Budapest's doorstep. The preconditions for a vast and brutal struggle had been established. Converging armies with irreconcilable aims, populations under duress, and strategic imperatives that would transform Romania into a battleground on the road to Hungary's capital. The opening phase of the campaign unfolded in September and October 1944 as Soviet and Romanian forces advanced westward across Transylvania. The Soviet Second Ukrainian Front launched a series of coordinated attacks aimed at breaking through Axis defensive lines along the Carpathian passes. These operations involved the 40th and 53rd Armies, supported by the 4th Guards Mechanized Corps and extensive artillery groupings. Romanian units, reorganized after the August coup, were integrated into the offensive, including the Romanian 1st and 4th Armies under General Nicolae Maițici and General Gheorghe Avramescu. Their combined strength reached nearly 500,000 men, though much of the Romanian equipment was outdated and reliant on Soviet resupply. Opposing them, the Axis attempted to establish a stable front in northern and western Transylvania. The German 8th Army, reinforced by Hungarian Corps, deployed along key routes leading toward Cluj and Oradea. The Hungarian 2nd Army, numbering around 1,000 troops, defended its national territory with determination, regarding the Romanian advance as both a military and political threat. German commanders sought to use the terrain to their advantage, anchoring defenses on mountain ridges, fortified villages, and river crossings. These positions slowed the Soviet advance but required constant reinforcement, stretching already depleted Axis resources. The battles of Turda and Cluj in September became early tests of strength. At Turda, Soviet and Romanian forces attempted to encircle Hungarian defenders by combining armored thrusts with infantry assaults. The defenders, supported by German panzer divisions equipped with Panthers and Stugs, launched counterattacks that briefly restored the situation. For nearly 3 weeks, control of the area shifted back and forth, resulting in thousands of casualties on both sides. Romanian infantry bore heavy losses, while Soviet tank brigades expended significant resources in trying to force breakthroughs. Axis reports indicated the destruction of dozens of Soviet tanks, while Soviet communiques emphasized the gradual erosion of Hungarian resistance. Civilian populations in Transylvanian towns experienced direct consequences. Romanian villages welcomed the arrival of their national troops, but Hungarian communities viewed the advance with apprehension, fearing reprisals and changes in administration. Refugee movements intensified as families fled combat zones to escape bombardments and requisitioning. Supply shortages affected both armies and civilians alike, as food and fuel were consumed by the advancing forces or destroyed by retreating defenders to deny them to the enemy. By mid-October, the Soviet and Romanian advance had achieved notable territorial gains. Cluj, a key cultural and administrative center, was recaptured by Romanian troops with Soviet assistance. This marked a symbolic victory for Romania, reversing the territorial losses imposed by the Second Vienna Award in 1940. The German and Hungarian forces, however, maintained organized retreats, establishing new defensive lines closer to the Hungarian border. These maneuvers bought time for the Wehrmacht to regroup and prepare the defense of the Hungarian plain, a vast open terrain more suitable for armored operations. The command structures on both sides were tested by the rapid tempo of operations. Soviet commanders pressed their subordinates for continuous advances, often at the expense of high casualties. Romanian generals navigated the dual challenge of coordinating with Soviet counterparts while reasserting their authority over a reorganized national army. On the Axis side, German officers complained of the declining effectiveness of Hungarian formations, while Hungarian leaders resented the heavy sacrifices demanded to defend German strategic interests. These tensions foreshadowed the difficulties that would continue as the front line moved inexorably toward Hungary. The opening phase concluded with the Red Army and its Romanian allies pushing across the last stretches of Transylvania. Although the Axis managed to delay their progress, the balance of initiative remained firmly with the Soviet command. The path to the Hungarian frontier was now open, and the struggle was about to intensify on the threshold of Budapest itself. Strategic planning for the continuation of the campaign in late October 1944 reflected the different priorities and calculations of the belligerents. For the Soviet Union, the principal objective was to reach and capture Budapest, thereby securing control of Hungary and cutting off Germany from the Balkans. Marshal Rodion Malinovsky's Second Ukrainian Front and Marshal Fyodor Tolbukhin's Third Ukrainian Front were to coordinate operations supported by Romanian armies advancing on converging routes. Their combined order of battle counted more than 40 rifle divisions, several mechanized and tank corps, and substantial artillery groupings, with air support provided by the 5th and 17th Air Armies. Romania's strategic goals were closely tied to those of the Soviets, but carried distinct national significance. The government in Bucharest, led by King Michael, and a coalition that sought to distance itself from the Axis years, wanted to secure the restoration of northern Transylvania, which had been ceded to Hungary in 1940. Participation in the offensive was meant to demonstrate loyalty to the Allied cause and secure Romania a position among the victors of the war. However, this ambition depended heavily on Soviet goodwill and operational success. Romanian armies, although numerically significant, relied on Soviet supplies of tanks, aircraft, and heavy artillery, without which their offensive capacity would have been limited. German and Hungarian leaders defined their strategy around the defense of Hungary as both a political and economic necessity. For Adolf Hitler, Hungary was the last reliable source of oil from the Nagy fields, and of bauxite crucial for aircraft production. The loss of these resources would accelerate the collapse of the German war economy. Militarily, the Hungarian plain provided one of the final natural barriers before Vienna and the Reich's core territories. The Wehrmacht, reorganized into Army Group South under General Otto Wöhler, included the 8th German Army and 6th German Army, supported by Hungarian units. They sought to establish defensive belts along rivers such as the Tisza, and to use the Carpathians as a shield against Soviet penetration. Logistical considerations played a critical role in shaping operations. The Red Army faced the challenge of moving vast quantities of ammunition, fuel, and supplies across rugged Transylvanian terrain and over extended lines stretching back into Ukraine. Engineers worked continuously to repair destroyed bridges and railways, while Soviet truck columns carried supplies forward over damaged roads. Romanian infrastructure, already weakened by years of war and bombardment, was further strained by the rapid transit of heavy equipment. Axis logistics were equally precarious. German supply lines stretched across Austria and Slovakia into Hungary, vulnerable to Allied air raids and partisan attacks. Shortages of fuel were acute, restricting the mobility of German panzer divisions and forcing commanders to ration every liter of petrol. Propaganda accompanied these preparations, shaping the perceptions of soldiers and civilians. Soviet broadcasts emphasized liberation from fascism and the promise of restored national borders for Romania. Romanian authorities highlighted the reconquest of Transylvanian cities as proof of national revival. In Hungary, government propaganda under Regent Miklós Horthy initially stressed the defense of the homeland against invasion, though this narrative soon fractured as political turmoil escalated. The German High Command framed the struggle as a decisive battle for Central Europe, calling upon Hungarian soldiers to hold the line against overwhelming odds. Misjudgments affected both sides. Soviet planners underestimated the resilience of German and Hungarian forces, expecting a rapid breakthrough into Hungary once Transylvania was cleared. German command, conversely, underestimated the scale of Soviet resources and the determination of Romanian troops now fighting on the opposite side. Hungarian leaders miscalculated the depth of their army's reserves, committing formations that suffered catastrophic losses and could not be replaced. By late October, strategic lines were drawn with clarity. The Red Army and its Romanian allies prepared to cross into Hungary with overwhelming numbers and firepower, determined to reach Budapest before winter set in. The German and Hungarian command sought to delay them at all costs, using defensive positions, counterattacks, and the natural geography of the Carpathian Basin. The stage was set for the next phase of the campaign, in which planning and objectives would collide with the realities of terrain, weather, and human endurance on both sides. The clash on Hungarian soil began in earnest during late October and November 1944, as Soviet and Romanian forces attempted to penetrate the border defenses and seize key towns that opened the way to the Hungarian heartland. The first major encounters occurred along the approaches to Debrecen and Szeged, where German and Hungarian units sought to block the Red Army's advance. The Debrecen operation, launched on the 6th of October by the Soviet Second Ukrainian Front, became one of the defining opening battles of the campaign. Malinovsky deployed the 6th Guards Tank Army, the 53rd Army, and the 7th Guards Army, supported by Romanian formations. Their objective was to cut off Axis forces retreating from Transylvania and to establish control over eastern Hungary. Axis defenders included elements of the German 8th Army and Hungarian 2nd Army, with armored support from the 23rd Panzer Division and Hungarian mobile units. Though numerically inferior, these formations benefited from familiarity with the terrain and the availability of armored reserves. Panzer IVs, Panthers, and Stu-G 3 assault guns were deployed in flexible counterattacks, striking exposed Soviet spearheads. The result was a fluid and costly battle fought over wide areas of the Hungarian plain. Soviet tank brigades advanced quickly, but often outran their infantry support, leaving them vulnerable to German ambushes. By mid-October, heavy fighting had led to the loss of more than 500 Soviet tanks and self-propelled guns, though German armored units also suffered significant depletion. Romanian troops participated actively, though their role was frequently constrained by limited armor and heavy reliance on Soviet equipment. Romanian infantry divisions fought in support of Soviet mechanized corps, engaging Hungarian defenders in towns and villages. For many Romanian soldiers, the campaign had a symbolic dimension, as the advance across Transylvania into Hungary represented the reversal of the humiliations of 1940. Nevertheless, casualties mounted steadily, and coordination difficulties between Soviet and Romanian commands sometimes slowed operations. The battle for Debrecen ended with the Soviet capture of the city on 20th October, marking a major step in the offensive. However, the Soviet encirclement attempts had failed to trap the bulk of German and Hungarian forces, which withdrew in relatively good order toward Budapest. This outcome meant that the Red Army would face continued resistance in the Hungarian interior, rather than the rapid collapse its leaders had anticipated. Meanwhile, further south, the Third Ukrainian Front advanced through Banat and toward the Tisza River, capturing Szeged on 11th October, with assistance from Romanian troops. The Tisza line became the next major defensive barrier for the Axis. German engineers destroyed bridges and flooded low-lying areas, complicating Soviet river crossings. Nevertheless, by early November, Soviet forces had established several bridgeheads west of the Tisza, paving the way for deeper operations. Civilians in eastern Hungary endured severe hardships as the front advanced. Villages changed hands multiple times, leaving residents exposed to requisitions by both sides. Food shortages became acute, and livestock was often seized to feed armies on the move. Refugees from Transylvania and Romania joined Hungarian civilians fleeing the battle zones, creating long columns of displaced persons. The Hungarian state attempted to manage these movements, but resources were limited, and many families found themselves without shelter as winter approached. The early clashes revealed both strengths and weaknesses in the opposing forces. The Soviets demonstrated overwhelming numerical superiority and the capacity to sustain offensive momentum across wide sectors. Yet, they struggled with coordination in fast-moving battles and paid a heavy price in armor and manpower. German and Hungarian units displayed tactical skill and defensive resilience, but their capacity to sustain losses was far more limited. Every engagement that cost them tanks and experienced soldiers reduced their ability to defend the capital. By late November, the Red Army had reached positions threatening Budapest directly from the east and south. The failure to annihilate the retreating Axis armies at Debrecen, however, meant that the city would not fall quickly. Instead, the stage was set for prolonged and bitter fighting on Hungary's central plain, where the defense of Budapest would become the focal point of one of the war's most grueling campaigns. The escalation of the campaign through November and December 1944 marked a shift from fluid maneuver battles on the Hungarian plain to increasingly static and attritional fighting around the approaches to Budapest. After the capture of Debrecen and Szeged, Soviet and Romanian forces pressed westward, forcing German and Hungarian troops to establish successive defensive lines along the Tisza River. The Red Army's 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts attempted to exploit their momentum, seeking to capture the Hungarian capital before the onset of winter. However, the rapid pace of operations strained logistics, and Axis commanders seized the opportunity to delay the advance with a combination of fortified positions, counterattacks, and scorched earth tactics. Crossing the Tisza presented significant challenges. Between 6th and 15th of November, Soviet engineers and assault troops carried out multiple forced river crossings under heavy fire. In some sectors, pontoon bridges were erected overnight, only to be destroyed by German artillery or airstrikes. At Szolnok and Szentes, Soviet infantry supported by armor managed to secure lodgements on the western bank, but casualties were high. German formations, including the 46th Infantry Division and remnants of panzer units, mounted counterattacks that pushed Soviet spearheads back into the river. Repeated attempts to expand the bridgeheads eventually succeeded by weight of numbers, but the delay allowed Axis forces to regroup closer to Budapest. The weather compounded operational difficulties. November rains turned roads into mud, immobilizing vehicles and slowing artillery movement. Supply convoys often took days to traverse distances that under normal conditions required only hours. Soviet armored units, reliant on steady deliveries of fuel and ammunition, found themselves advancing in fits and starts. Romanian divisions, less well-equipped and dependent on Soviet logistics, often lacked sufficient winter clothing and artillery support. These conditions sapped morale, and desertions, though not widespread, became a concern on both sides. Axis leadership faced its own crises. On 15th of October, Regent Miklós Horthy attempted to extricate Hungary from the war through a separate armistice, but the German response was swift. Operation Panzerfaust, executed by Otto Skorzeny's commando forces, forced Horthy's abdication and installed the pro-German Arrow Cross regime under Ferenc Szalasi. This ensured Hungary's continued participation in the Axis war effort, but it also deepened internal divisions. While the new government called for total mobilization, morale among Hungarian troops was uneven. Many conscripts fought defensively to protect their homeland, while others questioned the viability of resisting in the face of Soviet superiority. Reinforcements from Germany were dispatched to stabilize the situation. The 6th SS Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich began to transfer eastward from the Reich, although its arrival would not be complete until December. In the interim, German High Command committed armored reserves piecemeal, including the 3rd and 24th Panzer Divisions. These units counterattacked Soviet bridgeheads with some success, inflicting heavy losses, particularly against the 6th Guards Tank Army. Nevertheless, the broader balance remained unfavorable to the Axis. Soviet superiority in manpower and material allowed them to absorb setbacks and renew offensives with fresh forces. Civilian suffering intensified as the front closed in on Budapest. German authorities organized evacuations of ethnic German populations from southeastern Hungary, fearing reprisals and Soviet occupation. In Budapest itself, air raids became more frequent, damaging infrastructure and causing growing casualties among the civilian population. The Arrow Cross regime imposed strict controls, requisitioning food and fuel for the army, while also conducting political purges against suspected opponents. For ordinary Hungarians, shortages of bread, heating, and medical supplies marked the onset of a harsh winter under siege conditions. By early December, the Soviet and Romanian advance had reached the outer defensive belt of Budapest. The capital was encircled by a system of fortifications known as the Margaret Line, composed of bunkers, trenches, and anti-tank obstacles stretching around the city. German and Hungarian units prepared to make Budapest the focal point of resistance in the Carpathian Basin. For the Red Army, the failure to achieve a swift breakthrough meant that the campaign would now hinge on a protracted urban battle. Both sides recognized that the coming confrontation would be decisive not only for Hungary, but for the future of Central Europe. The escalation had reached its peak. What began as a rapid Soviet drive across Transylvania and the Hungarian plain was transforming into one of the war's most destructive sieges. The climax of the campaign arrived with the Battle of Budapest, which began in late December 1944 and extended into February 1945. Following weeks of preparatory offensives and encirclement maneuvers, the Soviet High Command launched a coordinated operation to isolate and capture the Hungarian capital. On 24th December, the 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts completed the encirclement of Budapest by linking their spearheads at Esztergom to the north and Erzsébet to the south, thereby trapping more than 100,000 Axis troops inside the city. This force, designated the Budapest garrison, included approximately 33,000 German troops from the 9th SS Mountain Corps and other Wehrmacht units, alongside nearly 7,000 Hungarian soldiers. They were supported by remnants of armored divisions and equipped with artillery positioned within the urban perimeter. For the Soviet command, Budapest represented both a military and political prize. Its capture would eliminate Hungary as a functioning Axis partner, secure vital communication routes in the Carpathian Basin, and demonstrate Soviet capacity to dominate Central Europe. Marshal Malinovsky and Marshal Tolbukhin directed more than 25,000 troops in the assault, with additional reserves positioned to counter potential German relief efforts. The offensive was supported by large concentrations of artillery and the 5th Air Army, which carried out bombing missions against Hungarian strongpoints and supply depots. Within the city, German Commander General Karl Pfeffer-Wildenbruch and Hungarian General Ivan Hindi prepared for a prolonged defense. Budapest was divided into defensive sectors, each garrisoned by mixed German and Hungarian units. Key bridges over the Danube were fortified, and government buildings, factories, and apartment blocks were converted into strongpoints. Supplies were rationed with strict distribution of food and fuel. Civilians, numbering over 8,000, were drawn unwillingly into the siege. Many were forced to dig trenches, carry ammunition, or provide shelter for troops. Bombardments and street fighting soon transformed entire neighborhoods into ruins. The Red Army's initial assaults targeted the eastern Pest side of the city. Soviet infantry and armor advanced through broad boulevards, encountering fierce resistance from German and Hungarian machine gun nests and fortified cellars. Each block required days of fighting to secure. Soviet commanders relied heavily on massed artillery barrages, which leveled entire districts, but often failed to dislodge entrenched defenders. The Danube itself became a natural dividing line, with defenders retreating gradually toward the western Buda Hills. Meanwhile, the German High Command organized a series of relief attempts, known collectively as Operation Conrad. Between early January and mid-February 1945, 3 major offensives were launched by the IVSS Panzer Corps, supported by elite units such as the 3rd and 5th SS Panzer Divisions. These operations achieved temporary penetrations of Soviet lines, in some cases advancing within 25 kilometers of Budapest. However, Soviet reserves, including the 7th Guards Army and Mechanized Corps, countered each thrust with overwhelming firepower. Fuel shortages and attrition gradually eroded the German capacity to continue these efforts. Inside Budapest, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Civilians endured bombardments, hunger, and the collapse of medical services. Disease spread in overcrowded shelters. The Arrow-Cross regime continued to enforce strict discipline, even executing those accused of defeatism. For Hungarian soldiers, morale fluctuated between determination to defend their capital and despair over dwindling supplies. German troops remained disciplined, but increasingly recognized the inevitability of defeat. By late January, Soviet forces had captured Pest and forced defenders across the Danube into Buda. The destruction of all remaining bridges cut off the 2 halves of the city, isolating the defenders further. Soviet artillery and airstrikes intensified against the Buda Hills, where German and Hungarian troops made use of natural elevations and prepared bunkers to prolong resistance. The struggle culminated in early February, when Soviet forces stormed the last strongholds, including the Castle District. On 11th of February, a breakout attempt by approximately 2,000 Axis troops ended in disaster, with only a few hundred reaching German lines. The fall of Budapest cost the Axis more than 8,000 killed, captured, or missing, while Soviet and Romanian losses exceeded 1,000, including tens of thousands of dead. Civilian casualties were also immense, though precise figures remain uncertain, with estimates ranging from 4,000 to 5,000. The city lay in ruins, with much of its infrastructure destroyed. For the Axis, the loss represented a strategic catastrophe, eliminating Hungary as a meaningful ally and exposing Austria to the advancing Red Army. For the Soviets and Romanians, it was a costly but decisive step toward final victory in Central Europe. The siege of Budapest thus marked the peak of the campaign, a convergence of massive military operations, political upheaval, and human suffering. It demonstrated both the determination of the defenders and the inexorable advance of Soviet power, setting the stage for the final collapse of German positions in the region. After the fall of Budapest in February 1945, the campaign entered a phase defined by resistance, adaptation, and relentless attempts by the Axis to regain lost ground. Despite the catastrophic losses suffered inside the Hungarian capital, German command remained determined to stabilize the front and preserve a defensive line in western Hungary. The Wehrmacht shifted additional formations into the region, drawing on units from Austria and the remnants of formations previously withdrawn from the Eastern Front. The objective was to buy time, protect Vienna, and preserve access to the oil fields around Lake Balaton and Tisza, which were among the last significant fuel resources under German control. For the Soviet and Romanian armies, the fall of Budapest did not mark the end of operations, but rather a transition to consolidating gains and preparing for the next stage, the advance toward Austria. Soviet commands emphasized rebuilding depleted units, redistributing captured material, and integrating Romanian formations into combined operations. Romanian troops, after months of heavy combat, were reinforced with Soviet equipment, including tanks and artillery, enabling them to continue as part of the advancing coalition. For both armies, the challenge lay in sustaining momentum, despite immense casualties and the logistical strain of prolonged operations deep in hostile territory. German strategy now focused on counterattacks, the most notable being Operation Spring Awakening, Frühlingserwachen, launched in March 1945. Although technically outside the time frame of late 1944 operations, preparations for this counteroffensive began immediately after Budapest's fall. Elite formations, including the 6th SS Panzer Army, were concentrated near Lake Balaton. Their task was to strike at Soviet bridgeheads, disrupt supply lines, and retake vital oil installations. In the interim, smaller counterattacks were mounted throughout February, designed to delay Soviet regrouping and prevent exploitation toward Bratislava and Vienna. Hungarian troops, though heavily depleted, continued to resist. The Arrow Cross government under Ferenc Szalasi demanded total mobilization, conscripting teenagers and older men to fill the ranks. New formations, often poorly trained and ill-equipped, were sent to reinforce the crumbling front. Hungarian soldiers displayed determination in defending their homeland, but the lack of sufficient armor, artillery, and air support limited their effectiveness. Many units resorted to defensive improvisation, constructing makeshift barricades, deploying captured Soviet weapons, and using terrain to their advantage. Partisan activity also played a role in the Hungarian countryside. Groups composed of anti-fascist Hungarians, escaped prisoners, and occasionally Soviet-trained operatives carried out sabotage against Axis communication lines and supply depots. Though militarily limited, these actions disrupted German logistics and forced the diversion of troops away from the main front. For the local population, however, the presence of partisans often invited brutal reprisals from German and Arrow Cross units, further deepening civilian suffering. Civilian adaptation during this phase reflected the grinding reality of a prolonged war. In Budapest, survivors of the siege struggled to find food and shelter amid the ruins, while in western Hungary, villages braced for the inevitable arrival of the Red Army. Farmers attempted to hide grain and livestock from requisition by both sides, while urban populations faced shortages of fuel and heating through one of the coldest winters of the war. Romanian civilians, though formerly on the Allied side, continued to experience hardship as their territory served as a staging ground for Soviet supply lines. Psychological toll weighed heavily on all participants. For German and Hungarian soldiers, morale declined as hope of reversing the strategic situation faded. Yet discipline remained enforced by military police and ideological indoctrination. For Soviet and Romanian troops, the exhaustion of months of continuous fighting, coupled with the destruction they witnessed in Hungary, created a mixture of determination and fatigue. Propaganda on both sides attempted to bolster spirits. Axis radio emphasized defending Central Europe against Bolshevism, while Soviet communications framed the campaign as the liberation of oppressed peoples and the road to final victory. By late February 1945, the front in Hungary had become a zone of continuous attrition. The Soviet forces sought to consolidate bridgeheads and prepare for the next offensive, while the Axis attempted to regroup and launch counterstrokes. The resistance and adaptation of all sides defined this stage. German and Hungarian defenders striving to hold what remained, the Soviets and Romanians adjusting to sustain their momentum, and civilians struggling to endure under the pressures of war. This period of stalemate and preparation would soon give way to another decisive confrontation that determined the ultimate outcome of the campaign in Central Europe. The turning point of the campaign in Hungary came in the March 1945, when German command launched its last major offensive on the Eastern Front, Operation Spring Awakening. This operation was conceived as a counterstroke to halt the Soviet advance, regain control of vital oil resources around Lake Balaton, and reassert German influence in Hungary after the catastrophic fall of Budapest. Adolf Hitler personally demanded the offensive, believing that success in Hungary could stabilize the front and prolong the war. The operation brought together some of the most elite and battle-hardened formations of the Wehrmacht, including the 6th SS Panzer Army, transferred from the Ardennes following the failure of the Battle of the Bulge. The Axis assembled approximately 400,000 men, including German and Hungarian troops, supported by around 600 tanks and assault guns, among them Panthers, Tigers, and Tiger IIs. Opposing them, the Soviet Third Ukrainian Front under Marshal Fyodor Tolbukhin, supported by elements of the Second Ukrainian Front, deployed more than 600,000 troops and nearly 1,000 armored vehicles, along with a significant advantage in artillery and aircraft. Romanian forces, though smaller in number, continued to contribute infantry divisions and logistical support. The stage was set for a massive clash along the swampy, still frozen terrain south of Lake Balaton. On the 6th of March 1945, German armored formations struck Soviet lines between the Valensay and Balaton lakes, achieving initial penetrations of up to 30 kilometers. SS divisions such as Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf spearheaded the assault, exploiting local superiority in tanks and tactical surprise. Soviet forward units suffered heavy losses in the first days, with several rifle divisions overrun. German propaganda hailed the offensive as evidence of renewed strength. Hungarian units fought alongside German forces, motivated by the defense of their homeland and the prospect of retaking lost territory. However, the offensive quickly encountered insurmountable difficulties. Spring thaw transformed roads into mud, immobilizing tanks and supply vehicles. Soviet engineers flooded defensive zones, turning fields into impassable swamps. The Red Army had anticipated the attack, having intercepted intelligence and prepared layered defenses in depth. Artillery concentrations and anti-tank guns inflicted steady losses on advancing German armor. Fuel shortages crippled German mobility, with many tanks abandoned after running dry. Luftwaffe support, once decisive in earlier campaigns, was minimal due to lack of aircraft and fuel, while Soviet air forces enjoyed near-complete control of the skies. By mid-March, Soviet counterattacks reversed German gains. The 4th Guards Army and 26th Army launched coordinated strikes against overstretched German spearheads, while mechanized corps exploited flanks and encircled isolated units. The Leibstandarte and Totenkopf divisions, heavily engaged in swampy terrain, lost hundreds of tanks and vehicles. Hungarian formations, lacking equivalent resources, were gradually forced back. Within 2 weeks, the offensive had collapsed. German losses amounted to more than 4,000 men, and most of the armored vehicles committed. The Soviet command declared Operation Spring, awakening the final failed gamble of the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. The defeat marked a decisive turning point. With their last reserves expended in Hungary, German forces were left incapable of mounting further large-scale offensives. The Red Army now held the initiative irreversibly. Romanian divisions integrated into the advancing Soviet formations, solidified control of captured territories, and pushed toward Western Hungary. Hungarian resistance persisted, but became increasingly fragmented. Morale among German troops fell sharply after Hitler accused the SS divisions of cowardice, an allegation that alienated even the most loyal formations. For civilians in the Lake Balaton region, the offensive brought immense suffering. Villages were destroyed in artillery duels, and thousands of residents fled westward, fearing both combat and reprisals. Farmers lost livestock and harvests to requisitions by both armies. The brief German advance was followed by Soviet reoccupation, creating cycles of devastation within weeks. Refugee columns clogged roads, mixing Hungarian families with retreating soldiers and remnants of German supply convoys. The turning point was not only military but also political. The collapse of Operation Spring Awakening demonstrated conclusively that Germany could no longer protect its allies or maintain control in Central Europe. For Romania, already aligned with the Allies, the outcome vindicated its decision to switch sides. For Hungary, it marked the irreversible erosion of national defense, leaving the country fully exposed to Soviet domination. By the end of March 1945, the Soviet armies prepared to launch their final offensive toward Vienna. The German counterstroke had failed, Budapest had already fallen, and the road to Austria lay open. The Hungarian campaign, once envisioned by the Wehrmacht as a defensive bulwark, had become the site of its last great defeat. The turning point had been reached, sealing the fate of both Hungary and Germany's war effort in the region. By April 1945, combat operations in Hungary had largely concluded, but the aftermath of months of fighting left the country devastated. The retreat of German and Hungarian forces after the collapse of Operation Spring Awakening turned into a general withdrawal toward Austria, with remnants of the Wehrmacht and the Hungarian army attempting to form rearguards along the western frontier. Soviet and Romanian forces, pushing forward as part of the Vienna offensive, bypassed many Hungarian positions and advanced directly into Austria, leaving isolated garrisons to surrender or be destroyed. Oh, for the Axis, the Hungarian campaign ended in defeat. The German Sixth Army, once rebuilt after earlier disasters at Stalingrad, was shattered again in the plains and hills of western Hungary. Losses in men and material were irrecoverable. More than 1,000 killed or captured since January, along with nearly all available tanks and armored vehicles. Hungarian formations, already depleted before the siege of Budapest, disintegrated under the combined pressure of Soviet offensives and collapsing morale. By mid-April, only scattered units remained in organized combat, most retreating westward to surrender to Allied forces rather than face Soviet captivity. The humanitarian consequences were severe. Budapest, after its siege, remained in ruins. Entire districts lay flattened by artillery fire, bridges across the Danube were destroyed, and basic utilities, water, electricity, and gas, were largely non-functional. Tens of thousands of civilians were dead, and survivors faced famine and disease. In rural Hungary, villages along the routes of battle had been burned or stripped of resources. Refugees filled roads, many moving toward Austria in hopes of safety. Others returned home to find their houses destroyed or occupied by military units. The Soviet and Romanian presence reshaped immediate post-war realities. Romanian troops withdrew gradually after April, their objectives fulfilled with the reconquest of northern Transylvania and participation in the Allied victory. The Soviets, however, remained as an occupying power, establishing military administrations and beginning to reorganize political life in Hungary. This created tension among Hungarians, who now faced the transition from Arrow-Cross dictatorship to Soviet-backed governance. Arrests of suspected collaborators, requisition of remaining resources, and the presence of Red Army troops marked the first phase of occupation. For German soldiers, withdrawal from Hungary symbolized the broader collapse of the Reich. Units retreating into Austria joined the last defenses of Vienna, which fell to the Red Army in April. Survivors of the Hungarian campaign carried with them the memory of desperate battles fought in defense of oil fields and cities already doomed by the imbalance of forces. For Hungarian soldiers, the war ended in fragmentation. Some surrendered locally, Others attempted to continue fighting under German command in Austria, and a few joined partisan or nationalist groups resisting Soviet occupation. Romanian participation carried political weight. Although their contribution was overshadowed by the size of the Soviet forces, Romania's armies had fought across Transylvania and Hungary, incurring heavy casualties, more than 17,000 by war's end. These losses underscored Romania's attempt to establish its place among the Allied powers, though in practice the post-war settlement placed the country firmly within the Soviet sphere of influence. The broader strategic consequences of the Hungarian campaign were decisive. With Budapest captured and German counterattacks defeated, the southern flank of the Eastern Front collapsed completely. The Balkans were secure under Allied control, and the Red Army had direct access to Austria and southern Germany. The elimination of Hungary as an Axis ally removed one of the last sources of manpower and resources for the Reich. As combat operations ceased, the immediate landscape of Hungary reflected devastation and uncertainty. The retreat, surrender, and occupation brought the end of the war closer, but for civilians and soldiers alike, the costs of the campaign were measured in destroyed homes, fractured societies, and the deaths of hundreds of thousands. The aftermath left Hungary not only as a battlefield of the late war, but also as a nation entering a new political order under Soviet influence. This phase of withdrawal and devastation closed the military chapter of the campaign, preparing the ground for the longer-term consequences that would shape Hungary's post-war history. The legacy of the battles fought on Romanian and Hungarian soil in late 1944 and early 1945 extended far beyond the immediate military outcome. For the Soviet Union, the successful advance to and through Budapest marked the consolidation of its dominance in Central and Eastern Europe. Politically, it secured a direct route into Austria and Germany, while ensuring that post-war Hungary would fall under Soviet influence. The Red Army's sacrifices, hundreds of thousands of casualties in less than 6 months of operations, were justified by Stalin not only as a military necessity, but also as the foundation for the post-war political order he envisioned. For Romania, the campaign carried dual significance. Militarily, Romanian troops had fought alongside the Red Army in some of the hardest battles, from Transylvania through to Budapest. Their contribution cost the country approximately 17,000 killed, wounded, or missing between August 1944 and May 1945. Politically, the alliance shift of August 1944 allowed Romania to reclaim northern Transylvania, but it also meant the establishment of Soviet control over its internal politics. While the Romanian monarchy and government hoped their sacrifices would secure independence and recognition by the Western Allies, the reality of Soviet military occupation dictated the country's trajectory into the Eastern Bloc. Hungary bore the heaviest burden of all. The siege of Budapest destroyed much of the capital, leaving nearly 40% of its buildings damaged or destroyed. Civilian casualties, including victims of starvation, bombardments, and reprisals, numbered in the tens of thousands. The defeat of the Hungarian army and the fall of the Arrow Cross regime ended Hungary's role as a German ally, but left the nation devastated and occupied. Post-war Hungary entered under Soviet administration, with its political institutions reshaped to fit the emerging communist model. The human cost, combined with the material destruction, marked Hungary's wartime experience as one of profound national trauma. For Germany, the campaign demonstrated the final collapse of its strategic options. Hitler's insistence on defending Hungary at all costs drained reserves that might otherwise have been used in the defense of the Reich's own territory. The commitment of elite units such as the 6th SS Panzer Army to Hungary, where they were decimated in the failed Operation Spring Awakening, ensured that by the time Soviet forces advanced into Austria, German defenses were incapable of mounting effective resistance. The campaign thus symbolized both the last attempt at a strategic counteroffensive and the irreversible decline of Germany's military capacity. Internationally, the fighting in Hungary underscored the divergence between Allied and Soviet strategic priorities. While Western Allied forces advanced from the West, the Soviet Union secured control of southeastern and Central Europe. This division laid the groundwork for the Cold War order that emerged after 1945. with Hungary, Romania, and other states firmly within the Soviet sphere of influence. The boundaries drawn in blood during the battles for Budapest and the Hungarian Plain would define Europe's political geography for decades. Commemoration of these events remains contested. In the Soviet Union and later Russia, the campaign was celebrated as a triumph of the Red Army, often highlighting the heroism of Soviet soldiers and the liberation of oppressed peoples. In Romania, memory of the campaign was shaped by the duality of regained territory and lost independence. In Hungary, remembrance has been more complex. The Siege of Budapest is recalled both as a national tragedy and as a symbol of resistance against overwhelming odds, while also marking the beginning of decades of Soviet domination. The historical significance of the campaign lies in its multidimensional impact. Militarily, it represented the destruction of Axis power in southeastern Europe. Politically, it reshaped the map of the continent and fixed Soviet influence across Central Europe. Socially, it inflicted suffering and loss on millions of civilians whose lives were irrevocably altered by occupation, destruction, and shifting borders. The battles fought on Romania's soil and at Budapest's doorstep were not only decisive episodes of the Second World War, but also pivotal moments in the making of post-war Europe.